May 19, 1944, 140 miles northeast of the Solomon Islands. The sonar operator aboard USS England pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, listening to the rhythmic ping returning from the darkness below. 200 feet down, maybe more. The submarine was there, moving, evading. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton stood in the cramped Combat Information Center, studying the plotting table where the target's projected course traced across the chart in grease pencil. Around him, 20-year-old sailors who had been civilians just months ago monitored equipment that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. Target bearing 035, range 1,200 yards, sir. She's turning to port. The Japanese submarine, I-16, a veteran boat that had survived 9 war patrols and participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, was about to encounter a weapon her commander had never seen before. A weapon that would render obsolete every evasion tactic the Imperial Japanese Navy had developed over 3 years of brutal submarine warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of her destruction had already been calculated. She just didn't know it yet. What neither the American crew nor their Japanese prey understood in that moment was that they were testing a principle that would fundamentally alter submarine warfare. The principle was simple but revolutionary: contact detonation rather than proximity explosion. It seemed like a minor technical distinction. In reality, it represented the difference between a 1 in 60 chance of success and a 1 in 6 chance, between depth charges that might frighten and damage, and projectiles that would punch through pressure hulls with the finality of armor-piercing rounds through paper. The weapon mounted on England's foredeck looked like nothing so much as a medieval siege engine reimagined for industrial warfare. 24 spigot tubes arranged in 4 rows of 6, each loaded with a 65-pound projectile carrying 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. The empty tubes resembled the spines on a hedgehog's back, which gave the weapon its name. But there was nothing cute or harmless about what those tubes contained. Each projectile had a contact fuse on its nose. Impact meant detonation. Detonation meant a 3 to 4 inch hole punched directly through the submarine's pressure hull. At depth, that hole meant death. The story of how this weapon came to exist, and why German U-boat crews in the Atlantic and Japanese submarine crews in the Pacific learned to fear it more than any other anti-submarine weapon, begins not with engineering triumph, but with desperate necessity. By early 1942, Allied convoy escorts faced a problem that traditional depth charges could not solve. The problem was called the blind spot, and it was killing merchant seamen by the thousands. Depth charges were 19th century technology applied to 20th century warfare. Large drums filled with explosives, rolled or thrown off the stern of attacking ships, detonated by hydrostatic fuses set to explode at specific depths. The theory was sound. The execution was not. The attacking ship had to pass directly over the submarine's last known position, which meant losing sonar contact during the final crucial moments of the attack. Those moments, perhaps 30 to 60 seconds, gave the submarine commander time to change depth, alter course, and disappear into the ocean's thermal layers and density gradients that confused Allied sonar. U-boat commanders called this period the dead time. British escort commanders called it the killing zone, because that's where merchant ships died, while their protectors chased shadows through the depths. The mathematics of depth charge attacks told a grim story. During World War II, British escorts conducted over 5,000 depth charge attacks. They achieved 85.5 kills. The ratio was 60 to 1, 60 attacks for every submarine destroyed. For context, that meant approximately 300 depth charges expended, thousands of tons of high explosive used, and countless hours of hunting for each confirmed kill. The inefficiency wasn't just wasteful, it was fatal to the Allied war effort. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied merchant ships. Admiral Karl Dönitz calculated that if he could maintain a sinking rate of 700,000 tons per month, Britain would starve into surrender within a year. The numbers supported his analysis. Allied shipyards couldn't replace merchant tonnage fast enough. More critically, they couldn't replace experienced merchant crews at any speed. A depth charge attack that failed to kill the submarine meant that U-boat would hunt again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until either the submarine's luck ran out or the war ended. The British Admiralty understood this arithmetic of attrition. In 1941, they had established a special unit called the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Naval officers and civilian scientists nicknamed it the Wheezers and Dodgers, partially because it operated outside normal military procurement channels, partially because its staff included older officers recalled from retirement and civilians deemed unsuitable for regular military service. The dismissive nickname missed the point. The DMWD existed specifically to develop weapons that conventional military thinking had dismissed as impractical or impossible. The concept that led to Hedgehog actually predated the war. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker of the Royal Artillery had developed the spigot mortar principle in the 1930s. Traditional mortars used a tube that contained the explosive charge, which limited the size of projectiles that could be fired. Blacker's design reversed this. His mortar had a steel rod, the spigot, mounted on a base plate. The projectile had a hollow tail that fitted over the spigot, with the propellant charge inside the tail. When fired, the charge detonated against the spigot, launching the projectile without requiring a massive tube to contain the explosion. This design allowed a single launcher to fire projectiles of varying sizes and weights. The Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar designed for home defense against German invasion, and later the PAAT anti-tank weapon, both used this principle. But the Admiralty had initially shown no interest when Blacker approached them in 1939, suggesting the spigot principle could be adapted for anti-submarine warfare. There was, they informed him, no naval requirement for forward-throwing weapons. By 1941, there absolutely was. The DMWD began with a weapon called the Fairley Mortar, tested aboard HMS Whitehall. It was designed to throw depth charges ahead of the attacking ship, keeping the submarine within sonar contact throughout the attack. The Fairley failed. The depth charges it threw were too large, the launcher too complex, the firing mechanism unreliable. But the principle was validated. Forward-throwing weapons could work. They had to work because the alternative was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The DMWD redesigned the system completely, applying Blacker's spigot principle to create a multiple projectile launcher. Instead of throwing large depth charges forward, they would throw many smaller projectiles in a calculated pattern. The projectiles would be small enough to arm and launch reliably, numerous enough to create a high probability of hitting the target, and simple enough to manufacture in quantity. Most radically, they would use contact fuses rather than depth fuses. The projectiles would only explode if they actually hit something. If they missed, they would sink silently to the ocean floor, leaving the water undisturbed and sonar contact maintained. This last feature was psychologically difficult for naval officers to accept. Depth charges that missed still exploded, creating tremendous underwater blasts that escort crews could hear and feel. There was comfort in those explosions, even if they killed nothing. The sound meant you were fighting back, hurting the enemy, even if you didn't sink him. At minimum, the explosions terrorized submarine crews, keeping them deep and frightened. Silent misses provided no such comfort. A Hedgehog attack that missed was just silence. No explosions, no visible results, just the knowledge that you had wasted 24 projectiles and achieved nothing. The prototype Hedgehog was installed aboard HMS Westcott, a W-class destroyer, in 1941. The initial tests were promising enough that production began immediately. By November 1942, 100 Royal Navy ships carried the weapon. That same month, Hedgehog achieved its first confirmed kills. The numbers should have been revolutionary. They weren't, at least not immediately. The problem wasn't the weapon, it was the operators. Royal Navy escort crews in early 1943 were exhausted, men operating with outdated tactics and insufficient training. They had been at war for nearly 4 years. Many had survived ship sinkings, watched friends drown in oil-slicked water, spent countless hours hunting submarines that vanished into the Atlantic depths. They trusted depth charges because depth charges were familiar. They produced explosions. Explosions meant you were doing something, even if that something was usually ineffective. Hedgehog was strange, new, and silent when it missed. Escort commanders rarely used it. By early 1943, the Royal Navy had become so concerned about Hedgehog's disuse that they issued a directive requiring captains to file reports explaining why they had not employed Hedgehog during submarine contacts. The explanations were revealing. Crews lacked confidence in the weapon. They hadn't trained with it sufficiently. The North Atlantic's heavy weather often soaked the firing mechanisms, causing misfires that launched incomplete patterns. Without a full pattern, the probability of hitting the target dropped dramatically. And, psychologically, silent misses were deeply unsatisfying compared to the visceral feedback of depth-charge explosions. The British solved this through systematic training and advocacy. An officer from the DMWD was dispatched to Londonderry, Northern Ireland, where convoy escorts based between Atlantic crossings. He conducted shipboard talks about successful Hedgehog attacks, demonstrating the mathematics of contact detonation versus proximity explosion. He brought photographs of debris fields, oil slicks, the physical evidence of submarine destruction. Most importantly, he brought the statistics. By mid-1943, those statistics were becoming undeniable. Of the 268 Hedgehog attacks conducted by the end of the war, 47 resulted in confirmed kills. That was a ratio of 5.7 to 1, compared to the depth charge ratio of 60 to 1. The difference wasn't marginal, it was revolutionary. And the reason was physics. A depth charge exploded at a set depth at a distance from the submarine. Water is nearly incompressible, which meant the explosive shock wave propagated outward in all directions. But water also cushioned the blast. The explosive force dissipated rapidly with distance. Even a relatively close miss might crack instrument gauges, create leaks, damage equipment. But direct kills required almost direct hits, and the blind time during attacks made direct hits nearly impossible. Hedgehog projectiles penetrated the submarine's pressure hull on contact, then detonated inside or immediately against the hull. The full explosive force went into the submarine rather than being cushioned by surrounding water. A single hit from a 65-pound projectile carrying 35 pounds of Torpex explosive would punch a 3 to 4 inch diameter hole in the pressure hull. At operational depth, typically 200 to 300 feet for submerged attacks, that hole meant catastrophic flooding. The physics of submarine destruction through Hedgehog hits were brutal and precise. Water entering through a 3-inch hole at 250 feet depth would flood at approximately 400 gallons per minute. That was 48,000 pounds of water per hour, or 24 tons. The incoming water would raise both the internal pressure and temperature inside the submarine. As the boat's internal pressure increased, the temperature would climb. Within minutes, the air temperature inside the submarine would exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit. At 300 degrees, the heat would sear the crew's lungs, killing them before the rising water did. Simultaneously, the flooding would destroy the submarine's depth control. The boat would sink deeper, increasing the external pressure, accelerating the flooding. If the submarine reached its crush depth, typically 400 to 600 feet for World War II designs, the pressure hull would implode catastrophically. The implosion would be audible to surface ships miles away. A heavy metallic crunch followed by smaller sounds of bulkheads collapsing and equipment being crushed. If even one Hedgehog projectile hit, the submarine was almost certainly doomed. 2 hits made survival impossible. The American Navy observed British Hedgehog development with intense interest. Unlike the British, who had been forced to develop anti-submarine weapons while simultaneously fighting a desperate defensive campaign, the Americans had time to study the lessons before entering the war. In late 1943, the US Navy began installing Hedgehog systems on their destroyer escorts, the DE-class ships specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. These vessels were smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, displacing 1,400 tons with crews of approximately 200 men. They mounted 3-inch guns rather than 5-inch weapons, sacrificing surface combat capability for anti-submarine specialization. The Hedgehog launcher was standard equipment on destroyer escorts. Installation required removing the forward gun turret to make room for the weapon's mounting. The launcher consisted of 4 cradles, each holding 6 spigots. The firing sequence was staggered, so all 24 projectiles landed approximately simultaneously in a circular pattern about 120 feet in diameter. The pattern was mathematically calculated to account for submarine evasive maneuvers during the projectile's flight time. A submarine attempting standard evasion tactics, turning hard to port or starboard while changing depth, would still likely encounter at least one projectile. The pattern was designed around probability theory and extensive testing with scale models. Reloading the launcher took approximately 3 minutes with a well-trained crew. Each projectile was 46.5 inches long, with a 7.2-inch diameter. The contact fuse on the nose armed during flight. An impeller on the nose spun as the projectile descended through the water, screwing the primer into the warhead. This safety mechanism prevented accidental detonation if a projectile was dropped or misfired. The projectiles sank at approximately 23 feet per second, reaching a submarine at 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds. That gave submarine commanders almost no time to react once the pattern was in the water. The tactical advantages of Hedgehog over depth charges were multiple and significant. First, the attacking ship maintained sonar contact throughout the attack. There was no blind time, no period during which the submarine could evade undetected. Second, the forward throwing capability meant the ship could attack while approaching rather than having to pass over the naked target. This maintained surprise. Third, unsuccessful attacks did not disturb the water with massive explosions, allowing immediate follow-up attacks. Fourth, the contact detonation meant target depth didn't need to be known precisely. Depth charges had to be set for the correct depth. An error of 50 feet meant the explosive force was too far away to damage the submarine. Hedgehog projectiles would hit at whatever depth the submarine was at. And finally, any explosion indicated a hit. Sonar operators listening through the water knew immediately whether the attack succeeded or failed. The disadvantages were primarily psychological rather than tactical. Depth charge attacks, even unsuccessful ones, had significant morale effects on submarine crews. Hundreds of explosions over many hours created a psychological torture that degraded crew effectiveness, forced mistakes, sometimes resulted in surfacing, even when the submarine could have remained submerged. Hedgehog attacks that missed were silent, providing no such psychological pressure. Additionally, escort crews found the silence of misses deeply unsatisfying. They couldn't know if they were close or if their attack geometry was completely wrong. Depth charges at least provided feedback through sound. But by mid-1944, tactical doctrine and crew training had evolved to maximize Hedgehog's effectiveness. The development of combat information centers aboard American ships proved crucial. Under the CIC model, the ship's captain remained on the bridge directing the overall battle, but a subordinate officer, usually the executive officer, operated from a separate room where all tactical information, sonar contacts, radar plots, and navigation data converged. The CIC officer could calculate attack geometry, coordinate with the sonar operator and weapons crews, and execute Hedgehog attacks with mathematical precision. This division of labor improved combat performance dramatically. By 1944, advanced sonar and radar systems fed targeting information directly to the Hedgehog launchers. The accuracy improvement was dramatic. From mid-1944 through the end of the war, Hedgehog kill ratios improved from roughly 1 in 6 attacks to 1 in 5. That 20% success rate, compared to depth charges less than 2% success rate, represented an order of magnitude improvement, and it showed in the statistics of submarine losses. Of the last 16 U-boats sunk by U.S. Navy destroyer escorts in World War II, 11 were killed using forward-throwing projectiles like Hedgehog. The weapon that had seemed strange and unsatisfying in 1942 had become the dominant submarine killing technology by 1944. USS England, commissioned in December 1943, represented the perfected combination of destroyer escort design, Hedgehog weaponry, and trained crew. Named for Ensign John Charles England, killed aboard the battleship Oklahoma during the Pearl Harbor attack, the ship had developed a reputation as exceptionally well-trained. Her executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, had served aboard destroyers in the Atlantic, then spent time at the Submarine Chaser Training Center in Miami, where he gained extensive experience attacking both real and simulated submarines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He understood submarine evasion tactics intimately. He could anticipate what a submarine commander would do when attacked, and he could translate that anticipation into attack geometry that put Hedgehog projectiles into the water exactly where the submarine would be, not where it had been. This was the ship that detected I-16 on the afternoon of May 19, 1944. And what happened next would demonstrate exactly how deadly the Hedgehog could be in the hands of a crew that understood its capabilities completely. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton studied the tactical plot as his sonar operator called out the submarine's movements. I-16 was executing standard Japanese evasive maneuvers, radical turns combined with depth changes designed to break sonar contact. These tactics had worked effectively against conventional depth charge attacks. Against Hedgehog, they were about to prove inadequate. Williamson, the executive officer, was conning the ship from the Combat Information Center. He had studied this moment in training exercises dozens of times. The geometry was clear in his mind. The submarine was at approximately 130 feet depth, turning to port, trying to follow England's wake where sonar detection became difficult. Standard evasion. Predictable. Exploitable. Come left to 020. All ahead 1/3. Prepare to fire Hedgehog. The launcher crews on the foredeck stood ready. The 24 projectiles were loaded, the firing circuits tested and verified. Through the ship's announcing system, the crew heard the order they had trained for. Stand by for Hedgehog launch. The first salvo fired at 13:41 hours. The launcher erupted in a carefully staggered sequence, each projectile arcing up and forward, then plunging into the Pacific waters ahead of England's bow. The pattern was perfect. 120-foot circle of descending explosives. Sonar tracked the submarine's position. The projectiles sank. Silence. The attack had missed. I-16 had turned sharper than Williamson calculated, positioning herself just outside the pattern. No explosions meant no hits, but it also meant the water remained undisturbed. Sonar contact held firm. The submarine's position remained precisely known. Depth charge attacks created acoustic chaos that took 15 minutes to clear. Hedgehog misses left the tactical picture unchanged. England could attack again immediately. Target is continuing turn to port. She's trying to get under us, following our wake. Come right to 045. Prepare for second Hedgehog attack. The tactical insight Williamson possessed came from months studying submarine psychology. A commander who evaded one attack pattern would often repeat the successful maneuver, assuming it would work again. I-16's captain was following his training, using tactics that had kept him alive through 9 previous war patrols. Those tactics assumed the attacking ship would lose contact during the attack run and would need to reacquire the target before attacking again. Hedgehog changed that assumption. There was no lost contact, no reacquisition time, just continuous tracking and immediate follow-up attacks. The second salvo launched at 13:50 hours. This time, Williamson had adjusted for the submarine's turning rate and depth change. The projectiles fell in a pattern calculated to intercept I-16's projected position 9 seconds after launch. One projectile struck the submarine's hull near the forward torpedo room. The contact fuse functioned as designed. 35 pounds of Torpex explosive detonated against the pressure hull. The explosion was audible throughout England. A muffled thump transmitted through the water, different from the massive concussion of depth charges, but unmistakable in its meaning. One hit. The submarine was damaged but not destroyed. I-16 continued maneuvering, her commander fighting to keep his boat alive. The third attack came at 14:10 hours. Williamson calculated the submarine would dive deeper, seeking the safety of greater depth where American sonar became less effective. He set the attack geometry for 325 feet. The projectiles descended. Silence. The attack missed because the submarine was at 200 feet, not 325. The fathometer revealed the error after the attack. I-16 had stayed shallow, defying standard doctrine. The fourth attack at 14:20 hours also missed. The Japanese commander was proving himself a skilled tactician, varying his depth and heading unpredictably. But he was also operating a damaged submarine that was leaking somewhere in the forward compartments. Each evasive maneuver stressed the damaged hull structure. Time favored the hunters, not the hunted. At 14:33 hours, England launched her fifth Hedgehog attack. Williamson had studied the submarine's evasion pattern through 4 previous attacks. He recognized the irregularity was itself a pattern. The submarine commander was alternating between shallow and deep, turning hard, then straightening out. Williamson calculated where I-16 would be, not where she appeared to be going. The geometry was based on predicting the commander's next tactical decision. The projectiles entered the water in their staggered sequence, creating the precise circular pattern. 9 seconds later, the crew heard 4 to 6 distinct explosions in rapid succession. The sound, transmitted through England's hull, felt as much as heard. Multiple hits. The submarine's pressure hull ruptured in multiple locations. The destruction was immediate and catastrophic. A massive underwater explosion followed 5 seconds later. The blast lifted England's fantail out of the water, knocking sailors off their feet. I-16's high-pressure air tanks had ruptured, or her battery compartment had exploded, or accumulated hydrogen had ignited. The specific cause hardly mattered. The submarine was destroyed. 107 men died instantly or drowned in the flooding compartments as the boat sank into the Philippine Trench. 20 minutes later, debris began surfacing. Oil, rubber, pieces of wood, fragments of equipment. The debris field expanded through the afternoon, reaching 3 by 6 nautical miles by the following day. USS England had achieved her first submarine kill. But this was merely the beginning of what would become the most remarkable anti-submarine warfare performance in naval history. American codebreakers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. On May 20th, they decrypted a message revealing Admiral Noboru Owada's plan to deploy Submarine Squadron 7 along a picket line north of the Admiralty Islands. The submarines would be positioned at 30-mile intervals from 1 degree 30 minutes north, 150 degrees 30 minutes east, to 0 degrees 30 minutes north, 148 degrees 30 minutes east. Their mission was to intercept American aircraft carriers approaching from 135 degrees true. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding Japan's combined fleet, needed intelligence on American fleet movements. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were advancing across New Guinea. American task forces were gathering in the Marshalls. Toyoda could not determine whether the next American thrust would target the Marianas or continue west toward Palau and the Philippines. His fleet carried enough fuel for only one decisive engagement. He needed to know where to commit his forces. The submarine picket line would provide that intelligence, or so the plan intended. The 7 submarines assigned to this operation departed Saipan between May 14th and May 17th. I-16 was already at sea, carrying rice to isolated Japanese garrisons. The picket line submarines were Type Co coastal defense boats. Row 104, Row 105, Row 106, Row 108, Row 109, Row 112, and Row 116. These were relatively small submarines, displacing approximately 500 tons submerged, with crews of 50 to 60 men. They were designed for defensive operations near Japan's home islands, not long-range patrols in the open Pacific. But Japan's submarine force had suffered devastating losses by mid-1944, and these were the boats available. American naval intelligence decoded Owada's deployment orders with precision sufficient to plot each submarine's position. Rather than avoiding the picket line, the Americans decided to destroy it. Escort Division 39, consisting of USS England, USS George, and USS Raby, received orders to sweep the submarine line from south to north, attacking each boat in sequence. The 3 destroyer escorts formed a line-abreast search formation with scouting intervals of 16,000 yards during hours of darkness. Their mission was not to avoid the submarines, but to systematically hunt and kill them. On May 22nd at 0350 hours, USS George's radar detected RO-106 cruising on the surface, recharging batteries. Surface running at night had been standard submarine practice throughout the war. Allied radar made it suicidal by 1944, but Japanese submarine commanders often had no choice. Their batteries lasted only a few hours, submerged at moderate speed. They had to surface to run their diesel engines and recharge, despite the risk. George illuminated the submarine with her searchlight. RO-106 crash-dived, disappearing beneath the surface. George made a Hedgehog attack at 0415 hours. The attack missed. England regained sonar contact at 0425 hours and closed to attack. The first Hedgehog salvo missed. The second attack at 0501 hours achieved at least 3 solid hits. A large underwater explosion followed as RO-106's hull failed under the stress of multiple penetrations and catastrophic flooding. Heavy oil and debris bubbled to the surface after sunrise, confirming the kill. 1 submarine destroyed, 6 remained on the picket line. The 3 destroyer escorts reformed their search line and continued sweeping northward. At 0600 hours on May 23rd, USS Raby detected RO-104 on radar. The submarine dived when detected and began evasive maneuvers. Raby made 4 Hedgehog attacks beginning at 0617 hours. All 4 missed. USS George joined the attack, launching 5 Hedgehog salvos between 0630 and 0810 hours. Every attack missed. The submarine commander was proving exceptionally skilled at evasion, or exceptionally lucky. By 0810 hours, 2 American destroyer escorts had made 9 unsuccessful attacks over nearly 2 hours. The submarine remained alive, though trapped by continuous sonar contact. Commander Hamilton Haynes, the escort division commander whose flag was aboard USS George, was growing frustrated. 9 attacks, 0 hits. The submarine was winning through sheer defensive skill. USS England closed on the contact. Lieutenant Williamson studied the pattern of previous attacks, analyzing why 9 separate Hedgehog salvos had failed to connect. The submarine was using irregular depth changes, never establishing a predictable pattern. But irregular patterns created their own signature. Williamson calculated the probability distribution of the submarine's next position based on its energy limitations and the physical constraints of evasive maneuvering at depth. England's first Hedgehog attack missed. The second attack at 0834 hours scored an estimated 10 to 12 hits. The contact fuses detonated in rapid sequence, the explosions audible throughout the 3 destroyer escorts. 3 minutes later, sonar operators heard the sounds of RO-104 breaking apart underwater, the grinding screech of hull metal failing under pressure. At 10:45 hours, debris and oil appeared on the surface. England had achieved her second kill in 2 days. The pattern was established. England was not simply lucky. Her crew possessed a level of tactical proficiency and weapons employment that exceeded her sister ships. Williamson's ability to predict submarine maneuvers, combined with the crew's precision in executing Hedgehog attacks, was producing results that seemed almost impossible. But this was not luck. This was the product of intensive training, systematic analysis of submarine tactics, and mathematical precision in attack geometry. On May 24th, at 0120 hours, USS George detected RO-116 on radar. England made sonar contact at 0150 hours. The first Hedgehog attack came at 0214 hours. Sonar operators counted 3 to 5 detonations. The explosions were not followed by the massive secondary blasts that had marked previous kills, suggesting the hits had not penetrated the pressure hull completely. But breaking up noises indicated severe damage. Oil and debris appeared after sunrise at 0702 hours. By the following day, the oil slick covered several square miles. RO-116 was destroyed with all 56 crew. 3 submarines killed in 5 days. 4 remained. The systematic destruction of Submarine Squadron 7 was producing effects far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Admiral Toyoda's intelligence-gathering operation had failed completely. Instead of reporting American fleet movements, His submarines were dying without sending any reports. The silence from the picket line suggested either radio failure or destruction. Given the American capability to intercept and decode Japanese communications, Toyota had to assume the worst. His submarines were gone, destroyed by anti-submarine forces he could not match. On May 26th, a hunter-killer task force arrived to reinforce the 3 destroyer escorts. The task force centered on escort carrier USS Hoggart Bay, with 4 Fletcher-class destroyers providing additional anti-submarine capability. Commander Haynes ordered England, George, and Raby to proceed to Manus for resupply and fuel. The 3 destroyer escorts had been at sea continuously, running repeated anti-submarine patrols with minimal rest. They needed ammunition, fuel, provisions, and minor repairs. But the hunt wasn't over. While transiting to Manus, the 3 destroyer escorts continued searching. At 23:04 hours on May 26th, they detected another submarine. Row 108 was running on the surface, apparently unaware that her entire squadron had been destroyed. USS England gained radar contact before the submarine dove and commenced evasive action. England achieved sonar contact at 1,650 yards range and began tracking. USS Raby was vectored in for the attack. Her Hedgehog salvo missed. At 23:23 hours, England commenced her attack approach. The ship's Hedgehog magazine was nearly empty. Only 24 projectiles remained, exactly 1 full salvo. Commander Haynes was reportedly concerned about England attempting an attack with no backup ammunition. If the attack missed, England would be unable to make a second attempt. Lieutenant Williamson was not concerned. He had studied RO 108's evasion pattern during Raby's unsuccessful attack. The submarine commander was using depth changes effectively, but his turning rate was consistent. Williamson could predict where the submarine would be when the projectiles reached attack depth. The mathematics were clear. The geometry was correct. The attack would succeed. At 23:23 hours, England fired her remaining 24 Hedgehog projectiles. The staggered launch sent all 24 rounds into the water in the calculated pattern. Sonar tracked the submarine's position. 9 seconds after launch, the crew heard 4 to 6 explosions, multiple hits at 250 feet depth. RO 108's pressure hull ruptured. Catastrophic flooding began immediately. The submarine sank, taking all 53 crew to the bottom. England had achieved 4 submarine kills in 8 days. 3 submarines remained on the Japanese picket line. The 3 destroyer escorts completed their resupply at Manus and returned to the patrol area. By this time, the Japanese 6th Fleet Intelligence Section had intercepted and decoded American communications discussing the submarine hunting operation. They knew their picket line was being systematically destroyed. Row 105, commanded by Lieutenant Junichi Inoue with Captain Ryonosuke Kato, the submarine division commander, embarked, received orders to evade south and attempt to escape the hunting zone. On May 31st, the 3 American destroyer escorts located RO 105. The submarine's commander had survived previous close calls during the war. In August 1943, Row 105 had narrowly avoided 2 torpedoes fired by USS Tarpon through radical evasive maneuvering. In September 1943, the submarine had fired torpedoes at light cruiser USS Columbia but missed. The commander had also successfully rescued downed Japanese aviators on multiple occasions. He was experienced, skilled, and desperate to keep his boat alive. What followed was one of the longest submarine hunts of the Pacific War. USS George and USS Raby detected the submarine and commenced attacks. Over the next 25 hours, the 2 destroyer escorts made more than 20 Hedgehog attacks. Every attack missed. The submarine commander was using every evasion tactic in the Japanese submarine warfare manual. He varied depth constantly, changed heading irregularly, used thermal layers to confuse sonar, maintained absolute silence running between maneuvers. His crew performed brilliantly under impossible circumstances. Commander Haynes watched the attacks fail repeatedly. USS England was holding back per his orders, allowing George and Raby to continue the hunt. But after 20-plus unsuccessful attacks spanning an entire day, the tactical situation was becoming absurd. One submarine, damaged and running on nearly depleted batteries, was evading two destroyer escorts equipped with the most advanced anti-submarine weapons available. At dawn on June 1st, USS Spangler and USS England joined the attack. Spangler launched a Hedgehog salvo that missed. At that point, Commander Haynes sent a message that became famous in naval anti-submarine warfare history. "Oh hell. Go ahead, England." Lieutenant Williamson had been studying the attack pattern for 25 hours. He understood what the submarine commander was doing. The evasion wasn't random. It was structured around conserving battery power while maximizing sonar confusion. The submarine would turn hard, change depth, then straighten out briefly to check pursuing ships' positions before maneuvering again. The brief straightening periods were predictable. They occurred at intervals, determined by the submarine's need to assess tactical geometry. Williamson calculated when the next straightening period would occur and where the submarine would be during that brief interval. England closed to attack position. At 07:36 hours on May 31st, she fired her Hedgehog salvo. The projectiles fell in the standard pattern, descending toward the projected position. 6 to 10 detonations followed, multiple hits. The explosions were followed at 07:41 hours by a major underwater blast. Row 105 disintegrated. All 55 crew died. England had achieved her fifth submarine kill in 12 days. 2 submarines from the original picket line had escaped. Row 109 and RO 112 had returned to port earlier, either due to mechanical problems or having received warnings about the destruction of their squadron mates. Row 117 had never deployed to the picket line. Of the 7 submarines sent to detect American fleet movements, 5 were destroyed. All 5 kills were achieved by USS England using Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. The performance was unprecedented in naval warfare history. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to USS England. "There'll always be an England in the United States Navy." The promise was fulfilled in October 1960, when guided missile frigate DLG-22 was assigned the name England, continuing the legacy. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to USS England recognized not just the ship but the effectiveness of Hedgehog as a weapons system and the importance of systematic training in anti-submarine warfare. The tactical implications of England's success extended far beyond the Pacific theatre. In the Atlantic, British escort groups had refined Hedgehog employment to similar levels of effectiveness. The second escort group, centered on HMS Starling and commanded by Captain Frederick Walker, achieved 6 U-boat kills in 19 days during February 1944. Walker's group used coordinated Hedgehog attacks, with multiple ships maintaining sonar contact, while one ship executed the attack. HMS Starling herself was credited with 14 U-boat kills during the war, making her the most successful anti-submarine warfare ship in history, measured by total kills. But England's 6 kills in 12 days remained unmatched. The feat demonstrated that in the hands of superbly trained crews employing correct tactics, Hedgehog could achieve kill ratios approaching 20% per attack. This represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare efficiency. The weapon that British naval officers had initially distrusted in 1942 had become by 1944 the dominant submarine killing technology of World War II. The German response to Hedgehog had been to accelerate development of acoustic homing torpedoes like the Falke, which could be employed without periscope use, allowing submarines to remain deeper and reducing exposure to attack. The Japanese response was similar, though their acoustic torpedo programs achieved less success, but these countermeasures could not overcome the fundamental advantage Hedgehog provided. Combined with contact-fused explosives that delivered full force directly against the submarine's hull. For submarine crews on both sides of the war, Hedgehog attacks produced a distinctive psychological terror. Unlike depth charge attacks, where hundreds of explosions created a cacophony that at least indicated the submarine's position was uncertain, Hedgehog attacks came silently, except for the lethal detonations of actual hits. A U-boat or Japanese submarine crew would hear the surface ship's propellers approaching. They would hear the splash pattern of projectiles entering the water, then either silence, meaning they survived, or the catastrophic crack of impact explosions punching through their hull. There was no intermediate state, no near misses that exploded harmlessly, no way to know if the next attack would be the one that killed them. The mathematics of Hedgehog destruction were unforgiving. At typical attack depths of 200 to 300 feet, a single hit created a hole approximately 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Water flooded through that hole at 400 gallons per minute. In a Type 9 U-boat, with internal volume of approximately 11,000 cubic feet, complete flooding would occur in roughly 90 minutes at a single hole flooding rate. But submarines at depth never lasted that long. The flooding destroyed depth control immediately. The boat sank deeper, external pressure increased, the flooding accelerated. Within minutes, the increasing internal pressure raised the temperature to lethal levels. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the submarine either imploded from exceeding crush depth or the crew died from heat and pressure. 2 hits made survival essentially impossible. The flooding rate doubled, temperature rise accelerated. Even if the submarine somehow reached the surface before sinking, the crew would be dead from heat exposure before the hatches could be opened. German U-boat crews called this phenomenon pressure death, distinct from drowning or implosion. American submarine crews called it cooking, a grimly accurate description of death by superheated steam and air pressure. The final statistics of Hedgehog employment told a story of technological advantage translating into strategic effect. During World War II, Allied forces conducted approximately 600 Hedgehog attacks against Axis submarines. These attacks resulted in approximately 120 confirmed kills, a 20% success rate. Compare this to over 10,000 depth charge attacks, resulting in approximately 120 kills, barely over 1% success rate. The difference was not marginal. It represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine warfare effectiveness. By 1945, virtually every Allied escort vessel carried either Hedgehog or its variants. The British developed Squid, a 3-barreled mortar firing larger 390-pound depth charges to longer range. The Americans developed Mousetrap, a rocket-propelled version requiring less deck space. The Soviets copied Hedgehog as the MBU, 200 inches, 1949, later developing it into the MBU 600 with increased range. The principle of forward-throwing, contact-fused anti-submarine weapons became universal among navies fighting submarine threats. USS England continued operations through late 1944, providing escort services throughout the Solomon Islands and participating in preparations for assaults on Japanese-held territories. On May 9, 1945, while operating off Okinawa, England was struck by a Japanese kamikaze aircraft. The suicide attack caused significant damage, but did not sink the ship. She survived the war and was decommissioned in October 1945, having served less than 2 years. During that brief service, she achieved more submarine kills than any other single ship in naval history. The legacy of Hedgehog extended far beyond World War II. Modern anti-submarine warfare still employs the principles the weapon established: forward-throwing weapons, maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack, contact or proximity fuses rather than depth-set detonation, multiple projectiles creating probability-based attack patterns. These concepts, revolutionary in 1942, became foundational to anti-submarine doctrine that continues today. The human cost of these technological advances was borne by submarine crews on both ATT sides. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during World War II, approximately 30,000 died, a 75% casualty rate. Of Japanese submarine crews, losses were similarly catastrophic. These men fought with extraordinary courage in vessels that became steel coffins once Allied anti-submarine technology achieved dominance. They died because physics and engineering determined the outcome before courage and skill could matter. The story of German U-boat crews encountering Hedgehog mortars for the first time follows a pattern repeated across the Atlantic from 1943 through 1945. A U-boat would be detected by Allied sonar while submerged. The commander would commence standard evasion tactics, confident that the blind time during depth charge attacks would allow escape. The surface ship would close to attack position. The U-boat crew would hear propellers overhead, then the distinctive multiple splash sounds of Hedgehog projectiles entering the water ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike the rolling thunder of depth charges being dropped astern, Hedgehog attacks came from in front, indicating the surface ship still held sonar contact. Then either silence, meaning the 24 projectiles had missed and sunk harmlessly to the bottom, or the catastrophic percussion of contact explosions against the hull. There was no intermediate state, no explosions that indicated near misses, no way for the U-boat crew to assess whether they had successfully evaded. They simply waited in silence, knowing that if they heard explosions, those explosions meant death. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was profound. Depth charge attacks, however terrifying, provided feedback. The U-boat crew could hear the explosions, count them, estimate their distance, assess whether the attacking ship had accurate targeting information. They could judge whether their evasion was working. Hedgehog provided no such information. The attacks came silently if they missed. If they hit, the submarine died before the crew could process what was happening. This is the story that repeated across the Pacific in May 1944 as USS England systematically destroyed Submarine Squadron 7. 5 Japanese submarines detected American destroyer escorts. 5 submarine commanders commenced evasion tactics that had kept them alive through previous engagements. 5 times, Hedgehog projectiles descended in calculated patterns through Pacific waters. 5 times, contact fuses detonated against submarine hulls. 338 Japanese submariners died because physics and mathematics determined the engagement outcome before their skill or courage could influence events. The examination of Hedgehog's tactical employment reveals a weapon system that succeeded not through revolutionary technology, but through systematic application of physical principles to military problems. The contact fuse was not revolutionary. The forward-throwing launcher was not revolutionary. The multiple projectile pattern was not revolutionary. What was revolutionary was recognizing that these elements, combined correctly, could solve the blind spot problem that made depth charge attacks so ineffective. The revolution was conceptual rather than technological. This pattern recurs throughout military history. Advanced technology rarely determines outcomes alone. The integration of technology with tactics, training, and doctrine creates decisive advantage. Hedgehog was deadly because Allied naval forces developed comprehensive systems around the weapon, combat information centers to coordinate targeting, sonar operators trained to maintain contact during evasive maneuvers, weapons crews drilled to reload and fire within 3 minutes, tactical officers educated to predict submarine movements and calculate attack geometry. The weapon was merely the delivery mechanism. The system made it effective. 4. The submariners who died beneath Hedgehog attacks. This systematic approach meant their traditional defenses were obsolete before they recognized the threat. U-boat commanders in early 1943 still believed depth charge attacks could be evaded through skilled maneuvering during blind time. By mid-1943, survivors were reporting that some Allied ships seemed able to track them continuously, attacking repeatedly without losing contact. By late 1943, the reports described attacks where projectiles came from ahead rather than from astern, and where any explosions meant death rather than near misses. German naval intelligence analyzed these reports and identified Hedgehog as the weapon responsible, but understanding the threat provided no effective countermeasure. Going deeper put submarines beyond effective combat depth, reducing their ability to attack convoys. Running on the surface exposed them to radar-equipped aircraft. Remaining submerged depleted batteries within hours, forcing surfacing despite the risks. There was no tactical solution because the problem was systematic rather than tactical. Allied forces had created an integrated anti-submarine warfare system that submarines could not defeat through individual skill or tactical innovation. The final lesson of Hedgehog's development and employment lies in organizational learning. The British developed the weapon in 1941, deployed it in 1942, refined tactics through 1943, and achieved decisive advantage by 1944. This progression from concept to combat effectiveness required systematic feedback from operational use, training programs that incorporated lessons learned, and willingness to trust new technology despite initial skepticism. Organizations that learn systematically defeat organizations that fight bravely but learn slowly. The Allied anti-submarine campaign demonstrated this principle through 3 years of increasingly effective employment of forward-throwing weapons. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.